President Trump even said it was shameful. The Supreme Court has ruled that the tariff bomb, which was President Trump's key weapon, is unconstitutional. The international situation may become even more unstable. Today, let's examine this issue closely. Let's begin. On February 20th local time, the United States Supreme Court ruled that the reciprocal tariffs imposed by President Trump on the world are unconstitutional. This is the first time the Supreme Court has clearly ruled one of President Trump's second-term policies unconstitutional. Since the Supreme Court has put a brake on the reciprocal tariff policy, which was a key principle of the Trump administration, the very foundation of the administration's trade strategy has been shaken. First, let's look at the Supreme Court's decision. The Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act does not grant the president the authority to impose tariffs. What's especially interesting is this. Out of the 9 Supreme Court justices, 6 are considered to have conservative leanings, but 3 of those conservative justices judged President Trump's tariff policy itself to be unconstitutional. Even more notable, 2 justices who found it unconstitutional were appointed by President Trump. The United States Supreme Court ruled that imposing the broadest tariffs without clear approval from Congress was an overreach of authority. In particular, Chief Justice Roberts stated that if Congress had intended to grant such a separate and extraordinary power to impose tariffs, it would have done so explicitly. Up until now, all tariff policies have been implemented with the approval of Congress. However, President Trump has argued that his tariff policies are justified, citing reasons such as national security. In the end, that was overturned by the Supreme Court in favor of Congress. Even the Supreme Court maintained the same stance as the lower courts, which had previously ruled the policy illegal. The main reason the justices found it unconstitutional was the separation of powers. In the appeals court, the judges also ruled that the authority to levy taxes belongs to Congress, and the Supreme Court upheld this perspective as well. Chief Justice Roberts pointed out that Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution clearly states that Congress has the power to impose and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. The Founding Fathers saw the taxing power as uniquely important and clearly included the authority to impose tariffs within it. They stated tariffs require Congress's consent, but now the bigger problem begins. The Trump second administration has secured massive tax revenue through high tariffs during the past period. The tariffs placed on both Chinese and allied countries' products acted as taxes and significantly supported the United States federal government's finances. The legal basis for those tariffs is weakening, causing the situation to shift quickly. If courts highlight potential executive power abuse or limit law interpretations behind tariff measures, demands to return collected tax revenue could become real. If this occurs, the accumulated tariff revenue could end up being a financial burden for the government. Major importers and global companies that have already paid tariffs to the United States have already begun large-scale refund lawsuits, arguing that if the tariffs were illegal, there was no obligation to pay them in the first place. The automobile, electronics, steel, and consumer goods industries could seek refunds totaling billions of dollars. As of early January, there have already been 914 lawsuits filed for tariff refunds. According to a report by Reuters, it is estimated that the amount of tariffs companies could be refunded may reach up to $150 billion, or about 220 trillion won. If the court rules in favor of the companies, the government's burden could snowball, as it would have to pay not only the refunds but also interest and legal costs. This is an issue that could place significant constraints not only on the federal government budget, but also on overall future trade policy, and its political impact is considerable. President Trump has used tariffs as a bargaining tool in diplomacy, making them central to his efforts to cut the trade deficit and pressure allies and rivals. If that legitimacy and legal foundation collapse, the administration's ability to advance its policies could be seriously undermined. The Wall Street Journal's editorial commented that this diplomatic pressure tool, which has been aggressively used to restructure America's trade agreements and collect tens of billions of dollars from companies importing foreign goods, has essentially collapsed. This could directly weaken America's negotiating power internationally, and subtle shifts are expected in its alliances. Until now, the threat of tariffs has been a powerful leverage at the negotiating table, but if that tool becomes legally restricted, other countries may not take America's pressure as seriously as before. This could also affect the restructuring of trade negotiations, adjustments to supply chain strategies, and the investment decisions of global companies. With the Trump administration's hardline trade strategy facing legal barriers, has the overall United States economic and diplomatic strategy reached a critical crossroads? This ruling is causing a huge ripple effect not only within the United States, but also around the world. The United States has used high tariffs to push other countries for concessions, offering to lower tariffs if they commit to investing more in the United States. Many major countries have agreed to these conditions to ease the burden on their companies. This is because lowering tariffs is directly linked to export competitiveness. Even if you just look at the case of Korea, the situation is clear, isn't it? In order to lower the tariff, which was as high as 25% to around 15%, Korea promised to invest about $350 billion in the United States. The plan included expanding production and facility investment in the United States in strategic industries such as semiconductors and shipbuilding. Japan responded to the tariff reduction negotiations by presenting an investment plan of about $550 billion in the United States, and the European Union proposed an investment plan of $650 billion. This was essentially the cost of lowering tariffs and a strategic choice to maintain access to the United States market. However, as the decision came out that mutual tariffs are unconstitutional, the situation is now being shaken up. If the tariff's legal effect ends or is suspended, the legitimacy of investment commitments based on those tariffs must be reconsidered. Within each country, there is a high possibility that voices will be raised saying that if the tariffs are invalid, the investment conditions should also be reconsidered. Public opinion is already moving in that direction. National investment plans worth hundreds of billions of dollars have huge political burdens. Identify main points and redundancies, shorten sentences for clarity, preserve key details and names, maintain the original perspective, ensure grammatical accuracy. A renegotiation is likely, which could lead to a new phase in United States relations. They must choose to keep the current terms or revise them. The United States faces challenges too. With tariffs as a weaker pressure tool, they must find other incentives or pressure tactics to uphold the agreement. This trend could create immediate uncertainty in global markets, as tariff policies, investment plans, and supply chain strategies may all change simultaneously. Companies might postpone investments or review contracts, and governments will likely start negotiations. For now, the global economy is expected to fluctuate significantly due to tariff and trade negotiation tensions. Of course, after the Supreme Court ruling, President Trump signed an executive order based on Trade Act Section 122 to impose an additional 10% tariff worldwide. So starting from the 24th, an extra 10% tariff has been applied. President Trump was very disappointed with the Supreme Court and its ruling, and the good news is that both the entire Supreme Court that made this terrible decision and Congress acknowledge it. He said the International Emergency Economic Powers Act provides strong legal authority for imposing tariffs. President Trump also listed other means of imposing tariffs even without the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. He mentioned Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, Sections 122, 201, and 301 of the Trade Act, and Section 338 of the Tariff Act, stating that tariffs could be imposed under these laws. However, the problem is that the tariffs President Trump has already imposed under Section 122 of the Trade Act cannot exceed 15%, and unless Congress extends them, they can only be maintained for 150 days. For Section 301 of the Trade Act, a tariff investigation is required, so it may take some time. Perhaps President Trump will try to continue his tariff policy by using other legal grounds. I think the impact of this will last quite a while in the international community as well. And the item tariffs on automobiles, steel, and aluminum based on the Trade Expansion Act are not affected by the ruling because they were not ruled on. The Trump administration may introduce new tariffs, like expanding item tariffs. Focusing solely on trade policy could cause us to miss the main point. The main issue is how much we should consider the president's authority. The issue is where the balance of the American constitutional order lies. The United States Constitution is designed with a very strict separation of legislative, executive, and judicial powers. Because taxes and tariffs are tied to property rights, they've been clearly assigned to Congress's authority. However, in recent months, due to repeated deadlocks caused by conflicts between Congress and the executive branch in American politics, there have been many more instances where the president pushes policies through executive orders. Presidential authority has been increasingly broadly interpreted using concepts like national security, economic emergencies, and international disputes to justify strong policies without explicit congressional legislation. President Trump's reciprocal tariffs also emerged in this context. Based on the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the administration imposed broad tariffs at its own discretion. However, this Supreme Court ruling has clearly drawn the line, sending the message that even with emergency powers, the executive cannot absorb legislative authority. This point matters because the decision extends beyond one president's policies and could impact all future administrations. From now on, whenever any president tries to push through economic policies citing national crises or security, this precedent is likely to serve as a strong constraint. With the judiciary now requiring explicit congressional approval for tax-like burdens, the administration must be more cautious. Another noteworthy point is the independence of the judiciary. Even with a majority of conservative justices, the court put the brakes on expanding the powers of the administration. This ruling can also be interpreted as a sign that it was based on constitutional principles rather than political calculations, and it can be seen as evidence that the balance of power is still functioning within the United States. We'll have to see if Congress regains the initiative or if the president finds another legal way to bypass authority, but this ruling clearly warns against governance based on executive orders. This marks a major shift that transcends trade policy debates and lets us assess the direction of the American constitutional order beyond United States political calculations.